In the middle of the 20th century, oppression and racism were challenged by courage.
We're willing to be beaten for democracy.
Leadership.
Negroes want complete equality, social, economic, and political.
And a dream.
We as a people will get to the promised land.
A crusade that galvanized a people. It unfolded in the courts and exploded on the streets. The demand for freedom and equality promised to unite the nation and threatened to tear it apart. It was the long, dramatic struggle of the Civil Rights Movement. In all of America's history, no war has been as divisive, as bitterly fought, or as costly as the American Civil War. The question of slavery, above all others, defined the conflict between the Union North and Confederate South. Through 4 long years, men fought and died to determine the future of slavery and the fate of the Union itself. President Lincoln declared that on New Year's Day, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any rebellious state shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery everywhere, but it marked a turning point in the war. Thereafter, every advance was a step toward Union victory and freedom for all who were enslaved. That victory came on April 9, 1865, when Union Commander Ulysses S. Grant accepted the surrender of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. 5 days later, John Wilkes Booth assassinated President Lincoln. The man who had fought so passionately to preserve the Union would not live to help bind up its wounds. That task would prove to be nearly insurmountable. The Civil War had ravaged the South. Cities like Richmond and Atlanta were literally reduced to rubble. And while buildings and bridges would rise again, the ideas and institutions of the Old South would not. The last will and testament of a Confederate officer named John Sargent Wise exposed the anxiety that plagued many Southerners.
And now, having experienced a death to Confederate ideas and a new birth unto allegiance to the Union, I depart. I see what has been pulled down very clearly. What is to be built up in its place, I know not. It is a mystery.
What had been pulled down was a way of life, built on the bondage and exploitation of others. But following Union victory, during what is known as the Reconstruction era, 3 new amendments to the U.S. Constitution extended to former slaves the blessings of liberty: freedom, citizenship, the right to due process and equal protection under the law, and the right to vote. Pennsylvania Congressman Thaddeus Stevens feared that laws alone would be inadequate.
The infernal laws of slavery have prevented them from acquiring an education, understanding the common laws of contract, or of managing the ordinary business of life. If we leave them to the legislation of their late masters, we had better have left them in bondage.
The concern was prescient. For die-hard Confederates, Reconstruction and racial integration were bitter pills. Through intimidation and terror, they sought to redeem what had been lost on the battlefield. Seething resentment toward northern invaders fueled the growth of vigilante groups, like the Ku Klux Klan, or KKK. Clad in white robes and bearing torches, Klan posses terrorized the South. One former slave recalled a Klan lynching.
I never will forget when they hung Cy Guy. They comed after him 100 strong. They ties him there in the woods, and with that blood they writes that he shall hang between the heavens and the earth till he is dead, dead, dead. Well, sir, the next morning there he hung, swinging in the wind.
By 1877, Reconstruction had succumbed to bitter opposition and backroom politics. Federal troops then occupying the South were withdrawn, and white supremacists were left to reestablish the racial hierarchy that had existed before the war. Across the former Confederacy, informal practices of racial discrimination were written into law. States instituted poll taxes, literacy tests, and other requirements that disenfranchised Negroes. They passed Jim Crow laws, which imposed segregation and other restrictions on blacks. A few blacks challenged the system of legal discrimination. In New Orleans, a man named Homer Plessy deliberately defied the Louisiana state law requiring separate rail cars for blacks and whites. He was arrested and jailed. But the incident led eventually to the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy argued that the law infringed on his 14th Amendment right to equal protection. But the majority of justices disagreed. The court's opinion read in part,
legislation is powerless to eradicate racial instincts or to abolish distinctions based upon physical differences. If one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them upon the same plane.
The court affirmed that segregation was constitutional as long as accommodations were separate but equal. It also left it up to the individual states, not the federal government, to guarantee equal standards. As the lone dissenting opinion, Justice John Marshall Harlan wrote,
the thin disguise of equal accommodations will not mislead anyone, nor atone for the wrong this day done.
Plessy versus Ferguson became a landmark decision. It sanctioned a system of institutionalized racism that would persist for decades, one that would require a second period of Reconstruction to overcome. In 1917, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson committed the nation to World War I in order that the world might be made safe for democracy. 400,000 black Americans would serve during the war, fighting abroad for freedoms they were denied at home, dying for a country where discrimination was widespread, where Southern Jim Crow laws relegated them to attend inferior schools, to drink from separate fountains, ride in separate streetcars, and where poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation prevented the vast majority of blacks from exercising their right to vote. Many Negroes fled the South during the period to find work in the factories and shipyards of the North. They found better jobs, higher wages, a brighter future, and in many areas, venomous racism. Competition for jobs between blacks and whites led to violence in many cities. Newspapers christened the summer of 1919 the Red Summer of Hate for the national frenzy of race riots and lynchings that gripped the country. Discrimination was endemic in the U.S. military as well. One young Army officer named Charles Hamilton Houston later recalled his experience during World War I.
The hate and scorn showered on us Negro officers by our fellow Americans convinced me there was no sense in my dying for a world ruled by them. I made up my mind that if I got through this war, I would study law and use my time fighting for men who could not strike back.
Houston lived, and, true to his word, took up the fight for social justice. He accepted a position as legal counsel for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1934, and joined the battle to overthrow the Southern system of segregation. Founded in 1909, the NAACP was a tireless crusader against racial violence. It focused on a legal approach to ending discrimination, fighting in the nation's courtrooms rather than in the streets. In 1919, the organization waged a high-profile campaign against the racist motion picture, The Birth of a Nation. The film's director, D.W. Griffith, portrayed Southern whites as the victims of lascivious blacks and carpetbagging Northerners. Klansmen were cast as valiant heroes. The NAACP criticized the melodrama as 3 miles of filth, but to no avail. It was fabulously popular and shaped a romanticized yet widely accepted view of the Reconstruction South that persisted for decades. Taking a cue from Birth of a Nation, Charles Houston and his team harnessed the power of the motion picture to document the disparity between black and white education in South Carolina. The visual record they compiled anchored a new 3-step legal strategy to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. Demonstrate that separate educational facilities were seldom equal. Make equality too expensive for states to maintain. Finally, attack the very principle of separate but equal. Under the guidance of Houston, the NAACP legal team filed case after case, slowly chipping away at the legal foundation of segregation. At the same time, the current of social progress was eroding the racial caste system. In 1947, Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in Major League Baseball. The next year, President Harry S. Truman issued executive orders to end segregation in both the federal workforce and the military.
But we cannot any longer await the growth of a will to action in the slowest state or the most backward community. Our national government must show the way.
Truman's public support for civil rights prompted a fierce backlash from Southern Democrats.
These uncalled for and these damnable proposals he has recommended under the guise of so-called civil rights.
As the NAACP prepared for its final assault on school segregation, Southern segregationists dug in and prepared for battle.
Paraphrasing the language of the great commoner of a generation ago, you shall not crucify the South on this cross of civil rights.
We may not win today or tomorrow, Charles Houston wrote in 1947, but the storm gathers, and all the pride and power of prejudice will be swept away. Houston did not live to see legal segregation abolished, but the fight continued following his death in 1950. In fact, it was time to test the final phase of his strategy. It was time to put the concept of separate on trial. The NAACP filed suit on behalf of the Reverend Oliver Brown and a dozen other families living in Topeka, Kansas. Brown's daughter, Linda, was forced to walk 21 blocks to the nearest black school, while there was a comparable white school only 7 blocks away. Their case was consolidated with 4 other cases of school segregation and came before the United States Supreme Court bearing one name: Oliver Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. On behalf of the plaintiffs, Thurgood Marshall argued that it was not enough to have equal public schools. He produced evidence that suggested segregation itself branded black children with a stamp of inferiority that affected their ability to learn. For the defendants, attorney John W. Davis based his argument on the 1896 precedent of Plessy v. Ferguson. He asserted that Negroes should not throw away the equality that existed between black and white schools simply to achieve prestige. For 17 months, the nation waited. Finally, on May 17, 1954, the court handed down its opinion. Before a hushed courtroom, Chief Justice Earl Warren read the unanimous decision.
In the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal.
The news resounded in every quarter of American society. The Negro-owned Chicago Defender newspaper wrote,
"Neither the atom bomb nor the hydrogen bomb will ever be as meaningful to our democracy as the unanimous decision of the Supreme Court."
Few Southerners welcomed the Brown decision. The most venomous critics predicted a new racial war.
Human blood may stain Southern soil, but the dark red stains of that blood will be on the marble steps of the United States Supreme Court building.
The progressive newspaperman, Harding Carter Jr., saw it differently.
For 75 years, we sent Negro kids to school in hovels and pig pens. We must replace trickery and subterfuge with an honest realization that every American child has the right to an equal education.
The initial Brown decision did not mandate immediate desegregation, but a year later, in a group of cases known collectively as Brown II, the Supreme Court urged that school districts make a prompt and reasonable start toward full compliance, and that Negroes be admitted to previously all-white public schools with all deliberate speed. The court had spoken, and many school districts willingly complied with its decision. But other Southerners, including some at the highest level of government, remained defiant. South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond drafted an official battle cry for states' rights, known as the Southern Manifesto. Over 100 members of Congress pledged their support for the document, which called on all Southerners to resist integration by any lawful means. Americans looked to President Eisenhower for moral leadership and to unite the country on the issue of civil rights. But the president did not favor the sweeping changes mandated by Brown.
If you try to go too far, too fast in laws in this delicate field that has involved the emotions of so many millions of Americans, you're making a mistake. I believe we've got to have laws that go along with education and understanding. And I believe if you go beyond that at any one time, you've caused trouble rather than benefit.
Off the record, the president went further. He called his appointment of Chief Justice Warren the biggest damn fool thing I ever did. Eisenhower's feeble public support for civil rights encouraged some Southerners to openly challenge court-ordered desegregation. Following the Brown decision, the Little Rock, Arkansas School Board developed a plan to integrate its public schools. 9 Negro students, who would become known as the Little Rock Nine, were scheduled to begin the 1957 school year at the previously all-white Little Rock Central High. Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus had publicly supported integration, but at the last minute, he changed his position.
I have therefore, in accordance with the solemn responsibilities and the oath of my office, taken the following action. Units of the National Guard have been and are now being mobilized with the mission to maintain or restore the peace and good order of this community. Advanced units
are already on duty on the grounds of Central High School.
The campus was swarming with segregationist protesters on the first day of school. National Guardsmen were drawn up in formation to prevent any Negro students from entering the building. Elizabeth Eckford later recalled her terrifying experience.
Somebody started yelling, "Lynch her, lynch her." I tried to see a friendly face. I looked into the face of an old woman, and it seemed like a kind face. But when I looked at her again, she spat on me.
Every day for the next 3 weeks, hundreds of sign-toting protesters stood vigil at the high school. But if these elements represented the entrenched prejudice of the past, some of Central High's white students symbolized hope for the future.
Well, now, what about this? Do you think that the trouble is with the students here in the high school and in the schools of Little Rock, or is it with the parents, or is it with outsiders, or where is the trouble?
I think it's the parents.
What do you think?
Well, I think it was just downright un-American. I think it was the most terrible thing that has ever been seen in America. I mean, yeah, I guess I'm sounding patriotic or something like that, but I always thought that all men were created equal.
Despite public cries for his intervention, President Eisenhower maintained that Little Rock's problems should be settled in the courts. Privately, he feared he would be forced to act. "If I do," he told an aide, "you can bet one thing. It will be quick, hard, and decisive." The issue was no longer segregation versus integration. It was a question of the supremacy of the United States government. Governor Faubus finally agreed to remove the National Guard troops. But that only fueled the violence. White mobs attacked members of the Negro Press Corps. One reporter, Alex Wilson of the Tri-State Defender, was brutally beaten and never recovered from his injuries. After weeks of patience, President Eisenhower was left with only one choice.
Certain misguided persons, many of them imported into Little Rock by agitators, have insisted upon defying the law and have sought to bring it into disrepute. The orders of the court have thus been frustrated.
The president federalized the Arkansas National Guard and ordered 1,200 Army paratroopers into Little Rock. He made it clear that he was legally compelled to uphold the Supreme Court's directive.
The very basis of our individual rights and freedoms rests upon the certainty that the President and the executive branch of government will support and ensure the carrying out of the decisions of the federal courts, even when necessary, with all the means at the President's command. Thus will be restored the image of America and of all its parts as one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Federal troops brought an abrupt end to the dissent, which had festered for nearly a month. With order restored, they escorted the Negro students to school. The crisis in Little Rock graphically underscored the hardening resolve of Jim Crow segregationists.
If we're wrong, why don't you arrest us?
As the civil rights movement swept across the South, place names like Birmingham, Neshoba County, and Selma would make Little Rock look like a beginner's course in racial violence.
I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice.
When abolitionist Theodore Parker wrote these words in 1853, he did so with a vision for the nation that few then held. 1 century later, the Brown decision seemed to vindicate his dream. It marked the beginning of the end for de jure segregation, segregation by law. But the practice of segregation De facto segregation continued, and challenging this Southern dogma could be lethal. In 1955, a 14-year-old Chicago boy named Emmett Till traveled to visit relatives in Money, Mississippi. A month later, his body returned home in a pine box. For the high crime of whistling at a white woman, Emmett Till had been beaten and shot, and his body dumped in the Tallahatchie River. The legal system had been too slow, the arc too long to save Emmett Till and countless other victims of racial violence. But in the mid-1950s, a new generation of activists mounted a campaign of direct political action and nonviolent protest to exorcise Jim Crow and its violent legacy once and for all. Their fight for freedom and equality became known as the modern civil rights movement. On December 1st, 1955, a department store seamstress boarded a city bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Her name was Rosa Parks. She was a Negro. When the bus driver ordered Ms. Parks to surrender her seat to a white man, she refused and was arrested. The popular legend of the tired seamstress reveals only part of the story. Rosa Parks was a seamstress, and she was tired. Just tired of giving in, she would write years later. She was also an active member of the NAACP. By the time Rosa Parks was arrested, community leaders had a plan in place to boycott Montgomery's segregated bus system. They were just waiting for the right person to be arrested. Someone who would anger the Negro community into action. Someone of unimpeachable character. Someone like Rosa Parks. Within days, the Montgomery Improvement Association was formed to guide the Montgomery bus boycott. It was the first large-scale and enduring protest for Negro rights. For leadership, the protesters chose a young Baptist minister, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Signs were posted around town. Don't ride the bus today. Don't ride it for freedom. The boycotters organized carpools. They rode in taxicabs. They walked. Through heat and cold, rain and snow, they refused to ride the bus. The city of Montgomery lost as many as 35,000 fares each day during the boycott. But even as weeks turned to months, they refused to meet with demands for more courteous service, equal seating privileges, and the hiring of Negro bus drivers. Instead, they held fast to their segregationist convictions and filed suit against movement leaders. Even under attack, King and the others would not be provoked to violence.
We still feel that we are right and that we stand within our constitutional rights in the protest. And we still advocate nonviolence, passive resistance, and still determined to use the weapon of love.
The idea of passive resistance was inspired by India's Mohandas Gandhi. Gandhi's campaign of nonviolent civil disobedience during the 1940s had confounded British imperialists and helped lift India from nearly a century of colonial rule. On the streets of Montgomery, passive resistance bore similar fruit. In November 1956, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld a ruling that declared segregated busing to be unconstitutional. The protest ended a month later, 381 days after it began. The Montgomery bus boycott was a major victory against racial segregation and propelled the civil rights movement to national attention. Martin Luther King became its public face and voice, its most influential leader, and its most lucrative target. During the bus boycott, King's Montgomery home was bombed and shot at. He was harassed and arrested. For King and the cause, it was symbolic of the determined opposition and deadly violence that lay ahead. In the wake of the Montgomery victory, Martin Luther King brought together other black ministers and community leaders to form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. With King as its president, the SCLC championed voter registration drives and supported bus boycotts in other parts of the South. At about the same time, President Eisenhower's Attorney General, Herbert Brownell Jr., drafted a proposal for new civil rights legislation. It was universally opposed by Southern legislators. Nevertheless, Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson guided a diluted bill to final passage by a 60-15 vote, establishing the Civil Rights Act of 1957. The NAACP's Roy Wilkins dismissed it as a crumb from Congress. Even so, it was the first civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. The law provided new authority to the Justice Department to oversee elections and investigate officials who interfered with voter registration. It also created a new division within the Justice Department to prosecute civil rights violations. The legislation was a symbolic victory for King and other civil rights leaders, but not enough to silence their rising demand for full legal, economic, and social equality. In some cases, the most deafening statements were made without uttering a word. In 1960, in Greensboro, North Carolina, 4 freshman college students walked into a Woolworth's drugstore and sat down at a lunch counter reserved for whites. The Greensboro Four, as they became known, were refused service, but they remained seated in silent protest until the store closed. Their sit-in continued for weeks and ignited a wave of similar demonstrations. Within months, the movement reached every southern state and attracted more than 50,000 students.
They come in and they sit down, and we're not used to them sitting down beside us because I wasn't raised with them. I never have lived with them, and I'm not going to start now.
Demonstrators encountered humiliation, abuse, and police harassment. But they held fast to their principles of passive resistance. During a sit-in staged in Nashville, Tennessee, silent protesters were chided with insults and attacked. They refused to fight back, but 81 demonstrators were arrested anyway on charges of disorderly conduct. John Lewis, who would rise to prominence with the movement, later recalled this life-changing moment.
It was really happening, what I'd imagined for so long, the drama of good and evil playing itself out on the stage of the living, breathing world. It felt holy and noble and good. That paddy wagon seemed like a chariot to me, a freedom vehicle carrying me across the threshold.
The arrests galvanized the Nashville student movement. Student leader Diane Nash led 3,000 protesters in the first major march of the civil rights movement. The aim? To challenge Mayor Ben West to take a stand on segregation.
And we needed him to say integrate the counters, or to tell Nashville to do what Nashville knows it should have done a long time ago, like about 95 years ago after the Civil War. So I asked the mayor, first of all, Mayor West, do you feel that it's wrong to discriminate against a person solely on the basis of his race or color?
Ultimately, the answer was yes. Within a month, Nashville became the first major city in the South to begin desegregating its public facilities. Building on the success of the sit-in movement, Nash and others formed a new organization to harness the energy of young people for the cause of civil rights, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. Younger and more aggressive than the senior civil rights organizations, SNCC members became the shock troops of the revolution, willing to take the fight to the racist enemy in the most intolerant parts of the South. As a Mississippi farmer named Hartman Turnbull would observe,
"Power seek the weak places, water seek the low places, but SNCC done seek the hard places, seemed like to me."
The sit-in protests attracted the first widespread media coverage of the civil rights movement. Photographs and film footage from places like Nashville provided many Americans with their first glimpse of the racism and discrimination that had infected the South for generations. News reports in October 1960 that Martin Luther King had been jailed for participating in a sit-in were brought to the attention of a young senator campaigning to be president. John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts was not a supporter of civil rights, but he recognized that political capital could be gained by reaching out to Negroes. At the urging of his advisors, Kennedy intervened on behalf of the incarcerated civil rights leader and helped win his release.
Well, I owe a great debt of gratitude to Senator Kennedy and his family for this. I don't know the details of it, but naturally I'm very happy to know of Senator Kennedy's concern and all that he did to make this possible.
The maneuver paid off. With King's endorsement, candidate Kennedy carried 70% of the nation's black vote and won the presidency by the narrowest of margins. As the new president assumed office in January 1961, many blacks rightfully expected bold new civil rights initiatives. But Kennedy had other priorities. His New Frontier proposals required the support of Southern Democrats, and Cold War concerns in Cuba, Berlin, Vietnam, and elsewhere left little room on the presidential agenda for civil rights. But the demand for change could not be quieted. The Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, spearheaded the movement's boldest initiative to date, the Freedom Rides, a descent into the Deep South by bus to test compliance with Supreme Court rulings barring segregated interstate travel. CORE founder James Farmer acknowledged the perilousness of the journey.
"I think all of us were prepared for as much violence as could be thrown at us. We were prepared for the possibility of death."
On May 4, 1961, 2 buses departed Washington, D.C., carrying black and white volunteers into forbidden territory. These were the first Freedom Riders. In Atlanta, they parted for the journey through Alabama. When the first bus reached Anniston, it was attacked and firebombed. The Freedom Riders barely escaped alive. The second bus met a similar fate in Birmingham. The city's notorious public safety commissioner, Eugene Bull Connor, made good on his promise to allow Klansmen 15 minutes to do their dirty work.
And with me are part of a group calling themselves the Freedom Riders, an interracial group traveling through the Deep South to challenge some of the segregated bus facilities in this part of the country. Yesterday they ran into trouble. They ran into violence. Today they say they intend to keep up their pilgrimage. Mr. Peck, you obviously have been injured. You're wearing bandages. What happened to you?
I got beaten twice yesterday by hoodlums, once aboard the bus and once in the terminal in Birmingham.
The attacks left the Freedom Riders wounded, terrified, and trapped among those who had tried to kill them. In Washington, the reaction of President Kennedy and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, was mixed. They feared for the Freedom Riders' safety, but worried that offering federal protection to the group would inflame the white South. "Tell them to call it off," the president demanded of an aide. "Stop them. Get your friends off those buses." But it was too late to turn back. SNCC leader Diane Nash recognized this as a watershed moment.
"If they stop us with violence, the movement is dead. We are coming."
Nash sent SNCC volunteers to replace the battle-weary CORE group in Birmingham. Learning of this, the president lost his composure. All hell is going to break loose. She's going to get those people killed. The situation fell to Bobby Kennedy. As head of the Justice Department, he was empowered to intervene if he suspected federal laws were being violated. He dispatched his assistant, John Siegenthaler, to Birmingham to rescue the Freedom Riders. On May 20th, Siegenthaler boarded a Birmingham to Montgomery Greyhound bus, along with the SNCC reinforcements. Their arrival in Montgomery was met by a mob of more than 1,000 screaming racists. Some Freedom Riders were able to flee, but others were overwhelmed by fists, iron pipes, axe handles, and baseball bats. John Lewis was beaten and bloodied. Siegenthaler himself was struck in the head with a pipe and kicked unconscious. With no other option, Attorney General Kennedy asserted federal authority by ordering 400 U.S. Marshals to Montgomery to restore order and escort the Freedom Riders to safety. Freedom Riders continued to probe the Deep South through the summer of 1961, inspiring arrests and violence, and forcing the Kennedys to confront the issue head-on. Bobby Kennedy began to see the civil rights debate in a new light, not as one issue among the thousands confronting the administration, but as the defining moral issue of the era. As a first step, he petitioned the Interstate Commerce Commission to adopt new regulations that would stiffen already existing federal laws, requiring all interstate transportation facilities to be integrated. But more importantly, the younger Kennedy's attitude influenced the president's evolving position on civil rights.
I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
In 1963, Southern segregationists got a new rallying cry, and the civil rights movement gained a new arch-villain. But even as Alabama's incoming governor, George Wallace, invoked the spirit of the Confederacy, movement leaders were preparing to challenge segregation and racial hatred in the state's largest city, Birmingham. Like many southern cities, Birmingham was struggling to throw off its racist legacy.
You've got to keep the white and the black separate, just like you got to keep them in school.
The town's top police official, Eugene Bull Connor, embodied the entrenched prejudice of the Old South. He had given Klansmen free rein to beat the Freedom Riders in 1961, just as he allowed them to persecute Birmingham's black population and firebomb their homes with impunity. By 1963, the public outrage sparked by the Freedom Rides and other high-profile civil rights demonstrations had disappeared. The movement needed to provoke the kind of newsworthy confrontation that would capture headlines and TV screens. If you're looking for a fight, Martin Luther King was told, you're sure to find a good one in Birmingham. King and the SCLC launched Project C on April 3, 1963. The C stood for the Confrontations, designed to bait Bull Connor into outrageous action. 9 days in, the campaign was in trouble. Martin Luther King had been arrested for violating a court order and was languishing in jail. It was here that he penned his famous Letter from a Birmingham Jail, concluding that one day the South will recognize its real heroes. King was released from jail on April 20th to find the Birmingham movement in peril. With few adults willing to risk jail time, the city's black youth rose up and marched into history. At 1 o'clock on May 2nd, D-Day, a group of students emerged from the 16th Street Baptist Church singing, "We Shall Overcome." Hundreds were arrested and loaded onto school buses destined for the city jail. The next day, Bull Connor called in the fire department and K-9 units. Teenagers and children became targets for high-pressure water hoses and snarling police dogs. News reports and images from Birmingham spread like wildfire. The New York Times called the events a national disgrace that made a mockery of the legal process. A letter to the Washington Post read, "If the United States doesn't stand for some decent average level of human dignity, what does it stand for?" Day after day for a week, the scene was replayed. Bull Connor filled the jail and then the county fairground with thousands of youthful prisoners. But still, more came. Birmingham business leaders finally agreed to negotiate. Within days, an accord was reached to desegregate the city. Events in Birmingham shone a hard light on America's race problem and influenced many citizens to re-examine their own views on the issue. Among them, President John F. Kennedy. 1 month after the Birmingham settlement, the president made an unprecedented statement on national television.
Next week, I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act, to make a commitment it is not fully made in this century to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law. The old code of equity law under which we live commands for every wrong a remedy. But in too many communities, in too many parts of the country, wrongs are inflicted on Negro citizens and there are no remedies at law. Unless the Congress acts, their only remedy is the street.
The president's call for federal civil rights legislation held staggering implications, but the opposition remained intractable and dangerous. The president was forced to use federal troops to ensure the admission of James Meredith, the first black student to attend the University of Mississippi in 1962. In Alabama, Governor George Wallace, who had promised segregation forever, staged his historic Stand in the Schoolhouse Door to oppose the integration of the University of Alabama. Only after federal troops arrived on orders of the president did Wallace relent, allowing Vivian Malone and James Hood to enter. And just hours after President Kennedy called on the nation to embrace civil rights, NAACP Field Secretary Medgar Evers was gunned down at his home in Jackson, Mississippi. Jim Crow was on the run, but he remained armed, dangerous, and determined to die in a blaze of glory. In the wake of Birmingham and the president's proposed civil rights legislation, Negro leaders announced a mass march to galvanize nationwide support for civil rights. For decades, this had been the dream of labor leader A. Philip Randolph.
Negroes want the same things that white citizens possess. All of their rights. They want no reservations. They want complete equality. Social, economic, and political. And no force under the sun can stem and block and stop this civil rights revolution which is now underway.
Randolph first raised the idea of a mass march in 1941, when he used it as a threat to encourage President Franklin Roosevelt to end segregation in federal government agencies and among defense contractors. 20 years later, Randolph's dream became reality. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom would be the greatest mass protest in the nation's history.
Freedom Now movement, hear me. We are requesting all citizens to move into Washington. We are pushing for jobs, housing, desegregated schools. This is an urgent request. Please join. Go to Washington.
Thousands set off for the nation's capital to show their support for civil rights. They came by car, by bus, by rail, from L.A. and San Francisco, from Cleveland and Chicago, from Jackson and Birmingham. Many who opposed civil rights predicted violence. But the march organizers went to great lengths to ensure none came. Security volunteers, equipped with two-way radios, would provide a first line of defense.
This is Freedom 2 to Equality 1.
250,000 participants, some say even more, converged on the mall in Washington, D.C.
We're going to walk together. We're going to stand together. We're going to sing together. We're going to stay together.
In his hands he's got the wide world.
Speakers and performers inspired the crowd. But the one who enunciated their universal call for justice most passionately was Martin Luther King Jr.
Because I have a dream. My poor little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
History was written today which will have its effect on coming generations with respect to our democracy, with respect to our ideals, with respect to the great struggle of man toward freedom and human dignity.
Everyone agreed it was a historic milestone in the civil rights movement. It awakened millions of Americans to the quest for freedom and equality, and stressed to Congress the widespread support for the issue.
I believe that the real significance of what we have started here today is that we have laid the groundwork for the building of a functioning, broad coalition of Americans from all walks of life.
The other thing is that we did produce a non-segregated march.
And I think this march will go down as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, demonstrations for freedom and human dignity ever held in the United States.
President Kennedy welcomed the leaders at the White House. His ambivalence toward civil rights had evaporated. With a 60% approval rating, the president looked forward to a second term in which he would consolidate public support for his civil rights proposals and press Congress to enact legislation. But it was not to be. On November 22, 1963, the president was assassinated in Dallas, Texas.
The greatest leader of our time has been struck down by the foulest deed of our time.
As deep grief swirled around Washington, the new president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, sought to reassure the nation.
Today, John Fitzgerald Kennedy lives on in the immortal words and works that he left behind. John F. Kennedy told his countrymen that our national work would not be finished in the first 1,000 days, nor in the life of this administration. But he said, let us begin. Today, in this moment of new resolve, I would say to all my fellow Americans, let us continue.
Johnson vowed to revolutionize America with federal aid to education, tax cuts to stimulate business, conservation programs, and to pass the civil rights legislation proposed by the late president. He called it the Great Society. But Lyndon Johnson also inherited a war in Vietnam.
If this little nation goes down the drain and can't maintain her independence, ask yourself what's going to happen to all the other little nations.
In 1963, it was no bigger than a fist on the horizon. But it cast a long shadow over the new president and all he hoped to accomplish at home.
Senator Eastland on 9-1.
Yeah, Mr. President, how you feel? I'm doing all right. I hope you are. You got a lot of sunshine down there? Needs rain might bad. Well, we're so dry in my country that we're going to have to sell off all of our cattle if we don't get a rain. Well, I'm in the same shape. Got a cotton crop that's burning up. How's it doing?
In June 1964, the secret White House taping system recorded this conversation between President Lyndon Johnson and Mississippi's influential Senator James Eastland. The two men were old friends, but their call was deadly serious. Just days earlier, 3 young civil rights workers had disappeared while working to register black voters in Mississippi.
Jim, we got 3 kids missing down there. What can I do about it? Well, I don't know. I don't believe there's 3 missing. You got their parents down here. I believe it's a publicity stunt. I'm going to tell you why I don't think there's a damn thing to it. They were put in jail in Philadelphia, and they were going to Meridian. There's not a Ku Klux Klan in that area. There's not a citizens council in that area. There's no organized white man in that area. So that's why I think it's a publicity stunt.
It was no publicity stunt, and both men knew it. President Johnson ordered FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to probe the disappearance. The FBI investigation that ensued, codenamed Mississippi Burning, would unveil the cauldron of racial intolerance, hatred, and violence that infected 1960s Mississippi. In 1964, fewer than 7% of Mississippi's 900,000 black citizens were registered to vote. Movement efforts to sign up new voters had been met by Klan intimidation, beatings, and death threats.
From all around the country,
SNCC's Bob Moses outlined a new initiative to confront the challenge directly.
We hope to send into Mississippi this summer upwards of 1,000 teachers, ministers, lawyers, and students from all around the country who will engage in what we're calling freedom schools, and in general a program designed to open up Mississippi to the country.
The project was called Freedom Summer. Middle-class kids from northern universities were recruited to help register black voters in rural Mississippi. As SNCC's John Lewis put it, Mississippi was deadly. Our people were essentially being slaughtered down there. If white America would not respond to the deaths of our people, maybe it would react to the deaths of its own children.
We're going down there, we're trying to face a real situation.
James Foreman led SNCC training sessions that prepared volunteers for police brutality, mob violence, and worse.
People should be expected to get beaten, they should expect to spend in jail, and it may go beyond the summer when they're in jail, and that they should expect possibly somebody to get killed.
21-year-old Andrew Goodman was among the first contingent to depart for Mississippi. On the first day of Freedom Summer, June 21st, 1963, Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner left project headquarters in Meridian to investigate the burning of a black church in neighboring Neshoba County. They were never heard from again. Within days, the FBI turned up the remains of their burnt-out station wagon, but there was no sign of the boys. As the intense search continued, locals refused to cooperate with investigators. The word on the street was, if they were killed, they got what was coming to them. Assistant Attorney General John Doerr condemned the lack of cooperation from local officials, saying, 1,000 eyes explored every corner of Neshoba County, but Neshoba County remained silent. 44 days into the investigation, the FBI received an anonymous tip. Even the buzzards sensed what lay beneath the Mississippi clay.
Mr. President? Yeah. Mr. Hoover wanted me to call you, sir, immediately and tell you that the FBI has found 3 bodies 6 miles southwest of Philadelphia, Mississippi. We have not identified them as yet as the 3 missing men, but we have every reason to believe that they are the 3 missing men.
The gruesome discovery solved half the mystery. Finding and prosecuting those responsible remained.
J. Edgar Hoover on 9-1.
I wanted to call you last night. I wanted to congratulate you on a job well done.
That's awfully nice of you indeed. You might be interested, the physical examination showed that each of these men had been shot.
Huh.
The 2 white men had been shot once each, and the colored fellow was shot 3 times.
Huh.
And we have the names of the people who did it. Now, to prove it is going to be a little tougher job. The sheriff was in on it. The deputy sheriff was in on it. The justice of the peace was in on it. And there were 7 other men. But we have all those names, and as I say, we're concentrating now on developing the evidence.
Only 1,200 blacks were added to Mississippi's voter rolls during Freedom Summer, at a brutal cost of 35 shootings, 30 bombings, 80 physical attacks, and 6 murders. 15,000 other Negro applicants petitioned the registrar but were rejected. But the Summer Project was far from a failure. It helped to launch the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which challenged the legitimacy of the all-white Democratic Party in the state. And it successfully focused national attention on the need for voting rights legislation, a cause that was destined to galvanize the movement and the entire nation in Selma, Alabama, 6 months later. When Lyndon Johnson assumed the presidency in 1963, movement leaders feared they would lose the meager gains achieved under President Kennedy. But the new president, a native Southerner, embraced the cause of civil rights as a great domestic challenge and a historic opportunity.
This bill is going to pass if it takes us all summer. And this bill is going to be signed and enacted into law because justice and morality demand it.
President Johnson applied his passion and political acumen to the cause. He encouraged congressmen, cajoled the press, and enjoined the public to support new civil rights legislation.
The Civil Rights Bill now before Congress is a far-reaching step in the direction of equality.
Legislators who resisted were subjected to the full force of the president's overbearing personality, the Johnson treatment. Johnson once said the only power he had was the power to persuade, to which an aide replied, "That was like saying the only wind we have is a hurricane." Within a year, Johnson achieved his goal.
Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law, and thus reaffirms the conception of equality for all men that began with Lincoln and the Civil War 100 years ago.
I am about to sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We believe that all men are entitled to the blessings of liberty, yet millions are being deprived of those blessings. Not because of their own failures, but because of the color of their skin. But it cannot continue. Our Constitution, foundation of our republic, forbids it. The principles of our freedom forbid it. Morality forbids it. And the law I will sign tonight forbids it.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the most sweeping civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. It outlawed discrimination on the basis of race, religion, national origin, or gender, and banned the practice of segregation in schools, public places, and employment. It was a major advancement toward racial equality, but it did not provide total equality. In many areas, literacy tests and other forms of discrimination still prevented African Americans from voting.
I hear you interpret. In other words, you tell what it means. It's like you mean it, your understanding of it.
To the president's chagrin, demonstrations continued. In 1965, protests targeted Selma, Alabama, the seat of Dallas County, where fewer than 1% of eligible blacks were registered to vote, and where bully boy segregationist Sheriff Jim Clark and his deputized citizens posse rounded up civil rights activists using Gestapo tactics and cattle prods. SNCC's John Lewis was among more than 2,000 demonstrators jailed in the first months of 1965. The Reverend C.T. Vivian, an organizer for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led the Selma campaign.
We're willing to be beaten for democracy, and you misuse democracy in the street. You beat people bloody in order that they will not have the privilege to vote. You beat me in the side and then hide your blows. But go on. No, I don't need to leave. We have come to register to vote. And you must realize that this is a national issue. It's not a Selma issue. It's not an Alabama issue. This is a national issue. Whenever anyone does not have the right to vote, then every man is hurt. No, I don't need to leave. We have come to register.
On the night of February 18th, state troopers savagely attacked Vivian and other demonstrators. In the chaos, a young man named Jimmy Lee Jackson was shot at point-blank range in what the local newspaper called a nightmare of state police stupidity.
He was murdered by the irresponsibility of every politician from governors on down who has fed his constituents the stale bread of hatred and the spoiled meat of racism.
The tragedy galvanized the Selma voting rights campaign. The SCLC's James Bevel proposed a symbolic march from Selma to the Alabama state capitol in Montgomery, more than 50 miles away. On March 7, 1965, SNCC's John Lewis and the SCLC's Hosea Williams led a procession of more than 500 marchers over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Alabama state troopers, clad in gas masks and riot gear, waited on the other side.
It will be detrimental to your safety to continue this march, and I'm saying that this is an unlawful assembly. You are ordered to disperse, go home, or go to your church. This march will not continue.
News cameras immortalized a hellish scene of police brutality and chaos. Images of Bloody Sunday shocked the nation. Time magazine reported that rarely in human history has public opinion reacted so spontaneously and with such fury.
We have no alternative but to keep moving with determination. We've gone too far now to turn back.
2 weeks later, Martin Luther King led more than 3,000 demonstrators in a repeat of the Bloody Sunday March. This time, there would be no tear gas, no bullwhips, no billy clubs.
At times, history and fate meet at a single time, in a single place, to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. So it was at Lexington and Concord. So it was a century ago at Appomattox. So it was last week in Selma, Alabama.
On March 15, 1965, President Johnson called upon Congress to enact new voting rights legislation.
Our mission is at once the oldest and the most basic of this country. To right wrong, to do justice, to serve man. The issue of equal rights for American Negroes is such an issue. And should we defeat every enemy, and should we double our wealth and conquer the stars, and still be unequal to this issue, then we will have failed as a people and as a nation. For with a country as with a person, what is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul?
When the Selma to Montgomery March reached its destination 5 days later, its numbers surpassed 25,000. 10 years after the Montgomery bus boycott christened the Civil Rights Movement, the crusade was at its zenith, unified, triumphant, and nonviolent.
I know you're asking today, how long will it take? How long? Not long. Because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. How long?
But even as Martin Luther King reassured the faithful that their goal was within reach, divisions between the old guard and young militants within SNCC threatened to splinter the movement itself.
In the same room where President Lincoln signed the first Emancipation Order in 1861, President Johnson signed the 1965 Voter Registration Act and pledged to millions of Americans a new chance to find a political voice.
On August 6, 1965, just 5 months after the violence of Selma and the President's civil rights appeal to Congress, Lyndon Johnson signed into law the Voting Rights Act of 1965. 5 days later, the Watts district of Los Angeles erupted in the worst race riots in the city's history. National attention was riveted on the streets of L.A. But the riots there were simply manifestations of the racial tension and rage that simmered in every major U.S. city during the period.
Is it too much to ask you to grant us human dignity? Should we be put there and shot to death for this request? If so, you can aim your gun. What the hell do you think we care about dying if you're going to deny us the right to live?
Poverty, unemployment, police harassment, unfulfilled expectations had created a tinderbox on the streets of inner-city ghettos. The civil rights movement had dismantled the Southern system of segregation and white supremacy, but it had largely ignored the insidious racism that festered elsewhere. Northern blacks were angry, disaffected, and easily seduced by fringe groups.
They call Mr. Muhammad a hate teacher because he makes you hate dope and alcohol.
Malcolm X had emerged in the early 1960s as a radical alternative to Martin Luther King and nonviolence, which he called the philosophy of the fool.
Condemning the racist practices.
As the chief spokesman for a black nationalist group called the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X espoused self-reliance and separatism rather than integration. To his admirers, he was a courageous advocate for black rights. But for many others, he symbolized reverse racism, black supremacy, and violence.
In a vicious cycle of poverty, of ignorance, of apathy, of disease, and of death. And they have these old Uncle Tom Negro leaders coming to Harlem telling you and me that times are getting better. Your times will never get better until you make them better.
During his lifetime, Malcolm X did not achieve the notoriety of figures like King, but he was assassinated in 1965, and in death became a near-mythic figure. His revolutionary rhetoric infected many civil rights veterans, especially within the core of SNCC.
You're going to sit in front of your television set and listen to LBJ tell you that violence never accomplishes anything, my fellow Americans. But you see, the real problem with violence is that we have never been violent. We have been too nonviolent.
Under the new leadership of Stokely Carmichael, SNCC assumed a militant posture beginning in 1966. The group's mantra of nonviolence was replaced by the chorus of Black Power. For Americans who were just beginning to warm to the idea of civil rights, Black Power was something altogether different. Martin Luther King considered the slogan, at best, an unfortunate choice of words. Roy Wilkins of the NAACP called it the father of hatred and the mother of violence. John Lewis feared that Black Power would divide the races and the movement. And it did. The new movement challenged the established relationship between whites and blacks. In some communities, Black Power was exercised in the voting booth. In 1967, Cleveland voters elected Carl Stokes as mayor. He was the first Negro to hold the position of chief executive of a major U.S. city. But in other parts of the country, Black Power meant bullets, not ballots. In Oakland, California, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale formed the Black Panther Party. What began as a community organization to provide free breakfasts and liberation schools to ghetto kids ultimately devolved into murder, rape, bank heists, and drug trafficking. The anarchy was not limited to California. Chicago, Newark, Minneapolis, Memphis. In scores of American cities, blacks rebelled against chronic racism and police brutality during the late 1960s. In turn, white America took up arms. Civil rights had become civil war. President Johnson's Great Society, a lawless society. By nearly any measure, the United States was immensely divided in the late 60s. Divided on civil rights, by the war in Vietnam, and by a generation gap without equal in American history. Black Power brought an end to the civil rights movement that began with the Montgomery bus boycott in 1956, but it never achieved mainstream recognition. The majority of Negroes, or blacks, as many now prefer to be called, still look to figures such as Martin Luther King for leadership. In April 1968, Martin Luther King traveled to Memphis, Tennessee, to speak in support of striking sanitation workers. The message of hope was familiar, but with an ominous sense of foreboding.
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
One day later, King stepped from his room at the Lorraine Motel and was gunned down by an assassin. From coast to coast, America erupted in violence. Edward Kozner of Newsweek recalled,
"It was a Pandora's box flung open, an apocalyptic act that loosed the furies brooding in America's sullen ghettos."
Once again, the heart of America is heavy, for a tragedy that denies the very meaning of our lands. The life of a man who symbolized the freedom and faith of America has been taken. The dream of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has not died with him. Men who are white, men who are black, must and will now join together, as never in the past, to let all the forces of divisiveness know that America shall not be ruled by the bullet, but only by the ballot of free and of just men.
The civil rights movement could rightfully claim victory in desegregating the South and opening its voting rolls to millions of blacks who had been disenfranchised for a century. But the rioting demonstrated that deep problems remain.
We need to know the answer, I think, to three basic questions about these riots. What happened? Why did it happen? What can be done to prevent it from happening again and again?
President Johnson appointed a special committee to study the violence and race riots of the late 1960s. The Kerner Commission concluded that America was moving toward two separate societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. It warned that frustration and resentment resulting from brutalizing inequality and white racism were fostering violence by blacks. As the 1970s dawned, African Americans were no longer at the back of the bus, but the challenge of achieving true freedom and equality remained. It would be left for the next generation and those who followed to finish, once and for all, what President Lincoln had started.